Thank all of you for scheduling an additional budget workshop for the library. I know this was an extra in addition to your schedule, so thank you to city councilors and to Finance Director Merchant and City Manager Mosier for taking this extra time so that our library trustees could attend in person. My name is Amy Weishart. I'm the director of the Ellsworth Public Library, and I'll present the library's fiscal year 22 budget on behalf of library trustees. They are the elected body that oversees the budget and has approved the budget. I have a few slides to share. I'm happy to answer any clarifying questions, and then I'll turn it over to library trustees for a few comments. And I do have copies of my slides to share at the end. So I just wanted to give a brief recap of some of what the library has been up to during COVID. We have been open to the public since July 2020. We're open 6 days per week, Monday through Saturday, 48 hours per week. So we've really been able to offer a lot of services to the public, even with COVID restrictions during the pandemic. We also offer contactless curbside pickup, also 6 days a week for anyone who's not able to come into the building or prefers not to. That's been a great service that I think we'll try to continue as long as we possibly can. In any given year pre-COVID, we would offer maybe 600 to 800 educational, recreational programs for all ages. So story times, lectures, author talks, and our staff really pivoted quickly to virtual programming, just like everyone did, so we embraced Zoom. Our staff have done a great job. So we presented a series of big read events just this past fall, focused around the book Lab Girl. We got a federal grant to put that programming together and work with some community partners. We did some COVID programming with Jackson Lab and with the hospital that was very well received. A lot of virtual story times, definitely a nice array of programming for all ages. And our programming is funded by mostly through our friends of the library, who they do fundraising for us, and through grants. During COVID, we saw an increase in demand for digital services, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of people at home virtually needing electronic books, audiobooks. So we expanded our services there. We launched Hoopla, which is the digital service. We offer ebooks, audiobooks, movies, TV, and music, always available. And that supplements what we were already offering. We also joined the statewide Minerva Consortium of 60 plus libraries. That's a shared catalog. And we give our patrons access to any book or DVD in the system. They have easy access. They can log in online, request a book from another library, and that comes directly to our library. So it's really value added for our patrons, and that's been very popular, very successful. We made that shift last fall. Coming up this summer, we're planning a Library on the Lawn project. So we got a grant from the Maine Community Foundation to expand our outdoor seating. We're expanding our Wi-Fi, and we're really looking at trying to encourage people to make use of our outdoor space so they can use we're also offering some Chromebooks for people to use, for the public to use. So we're encouraging people to stay as long as they would like. They can participate in Zoom meetings, job interviews, take an online class, and also make use of outdoor seating if they want to get takeout from a local restaurant, try to support some local businesses that way as well. We're also planning some outdoor story times this summer, just trying to expand what we can offer during COVID. So the fiscal year 22 budget, I know you have a copy of this in your booklets. Our total budget on the expense side is basically flat. So it's about $1,000 less than fiscal year 21. I'm probably, unless there are specific questions about the expense side, I'm happy to answer any of them. But since it's relatively a flat budget, there's really not much that's changed. We made some minor tweaks to some of our budget lines, so feel free to ask any questions that you'd like about our expense side. On the revenue side, the trustees are projecting $126,300 in outside revenue, and I'll detail that a little bit. And that's an increase over fiscal year 21 of almost $16,000. And then the city appropriation that the library trustees have budgeted or are requesting is a little under $545,000, which is 3% than they requested last year. It's 81% of the total budget, and that 81% is actually the lowest percentage that we've ever had of our total budget. So this is the breakdown of our fiscal year 22 revenue.
Amy,
Yeah.
excuse me, can we go back to the previous?
Yeah.
City appropriation of 544,907,
Yep.
that's your request.
That's the trustees' request. Yep.
And then you have 3% less than last year.
So this was last year before the $100,000 cut, just to clarify. Does that-
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep. So just a quick breakdown of our revenue sources. Non-resident card fees, this is a new fee we just started last October, charging a card fee for anyone who resides in a municipality that doesn't provide full funding to the library. So that is projected, we're budgeting $7,500 for that. Miscellaneous revenue is various fees for services, so printing, faxing, meeting room fees that we might charge, and we're projecting $12,000 for that. Fundraising is, we increased that revenue line, $15,000, and that's our annual appeal fundraiser. Just this past year, we did an art auction, virtual art auction fundraiser that was pretty successful for us. The investment fund, we have an investment fund that's mostly comprised of bequests. The library trustees use that, basically it functions like an endowment, so they can draw up to 4% of that investment fund each year. And they're budgeting $41,800, and that is the 4%. Town funding, they are budgeting $50,000, and that's an increase of $5,000 over last year. And then the city appropriation, which we've discussed. So just to put it in context, the percentage of the city appropriation that the library has, that has been, well, the percentage of city funding that's the library budget of the total budget has gone down quite a bit in recent years. So the earliest figures I have numbers for is fiscal year 2004. You can see this graph is to scale, but you can see it starts at 100,000 and it goes down to 100% goes down to 75%. So it's been hovering over 90% of our total budget for several years, many years. Starting in fiscal year 17, it started to go down, and it's now down to a low of 81% for fiscal year 22. And just another way of sort of contextualizing those numbers. So the decrease is mostly driven by increase in outside revenues. So for fiscal year 15, these are the two outside funding sources we had. Only two of them. We had the miscellaneous fees, and then we had town funding. So town funding is this bigger, no, yeah, town funding is the bigger portion. Miscellaneous is the bottom. For fiscal year 22, this is roughly to scale. We're at 123,000, so well more than double of what fiscal year 15 was. And I didn't show the historical, I just showed 2 years to give you some context. And so we now have 5 outside revenue sources, those 5 that I just mentioned. Unfortunately, the colors don't quite match up, but I can, if you can't read it, it's at the top here is the town funding. This is the investment fund. This is fundraising. Here's miscellaneous, and the card fees at the bottom are the lowest. I'm happy to answer questions about any of that. So I think, library trustees have really worked hard to increase not just the amount of outside funding, the dollar amount, but also the number of sources. So we're diversifying our sources of funding. And also, just to put that in context, the trustees approved a strategic plan in 2018, and we got some really good input from City Council at that time. And we had 6 major goals, and one of them was funding diversification. So the 2 pieces of that goal were to reduce the city appropriation and to increase annual appeal giving by 15%. So we've met both of those goals. The city appropriation has steadily declined since fiscal year 19 in dollar amount, and the percentage of total library funding has decreased since fiscal year 17, so we've seen a continuous decline. Annual appeal giving increased by 18% in 1 year. In 2020, we garnered 18% more than the previous year. And finally, just a quick survey that we did pre-COVID in winter 2019. We asked people who came into the library over a period of a couple of weeks, 3 really simple questions. Where do you live? Where were you before you came to the library? And where do you plan to go after you leave the library? Over 70% of them indicated that they would be patronizing an Ellsworth business. Either they came from a business or they were going to one. Grocery shopping, going out for lunch. So the library is a draw for people to come downtown, and definitely part of the economic development of our community. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer clarifying questions about our budget, and I know library trustees have some comments as well.
Amy, what's the current number of users, and of those users, how many are Ellsworth residents, please?
I actually have not run those numbers since we switched to our new system in October. I can pull those for you. The last time I looked, it was about 4,000 active users. A little over half were from Ellsworth, but I don't have the exact numbers, so I can pull those for you and send them around if you would like. Because I don't want to just make up I don't want to give you the wrong number, but so I can pull that data.
I'm getting lost with the numbers, trying to get it straight. So, for the revenue, what you presented, maybe is this the manager's budget, or is this?
This is the manager's budget.
Okay, and that differs from.
From what?
Okay, that's where I was getting. Okay, got it. Thank you.
And I have copies of this I'm happy to share if anyone would like one.
We'll take 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll also make a PDF of this available on the library's website for any members of the public who'd like to take a look.
Do you have any sort of fee for service? For example, if somebody's not really using the library for the books, but they're just coming in for the Wi-Fi, for example. Do you charge a fee for that if they're not a library card holder?
Not for the Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is free to the public, and it's 24/7, including weekends, evenings. So we see people using our Wi-Fi from the parking lot. So there's not a way we could, and we like to make that available. We do charge fees for printing. Faxing we added a couple of years ago, and that's been a nice service that we charge a little bit for. Meeting room use we do charge. Of course, during COVID we haven't been offering the meeting room, but I hope we'll get back to that soon. So
So the Wi-Fi is not like password protected?
no. Similar to City Hall, it's a similar network where the guests can just log in. Yep. Any other clarifying questions about my presentation? I know library trustees had some comments, so I can answer any more questions later, but. Thank you.
Good evening, Councilor Hamilton, Council. Since the This is a very important situation. My apologies, but I have a series of questions, but I'm going to read them from this, and then please ask any follow-up that you have. I know my colleague Spencer also has some things he'd like to address you with, so we'll probably alternate back and forth. The first one I have, let me put it in context, and this is why I need to do it this way. My apologies again for not looking at you and memorizing the entire dynamic. The Ellsworth Library Board of Trustees is entrusted by the city charter with governance of the library. Trustees under the city charter are entrusted with independent responsibility for establishing the budget in collaboration with the library director. The Ellsworth school system has an approximate equivalent of this in the school board and the superintendent of schools. As with the Ellsworth Library, the school board and superintendent establish a yearly budget of their own. The trustees and director of the Ellsworth Library have for the past 5 years presented yearly budgets that have consistently been lower than the previous year, to include the projected budget for 2021-22. The school system has appropriately been commended, and deservedly so, for bringing in a budget approximately 3% above the previous year. As with the library, there is also commonality in the fact that the Ellsworth school system receives tuition from area towns that contract with that system. The council has expressed reservations and concerns with the budget of the library as to how trustees have arrived at the amount of city funds requested. Puzzling in a way, since the Ellsworth Public Library is the only city department consistently to have reduced its yearly budget over the past 5 years. The question I have is this. It would be helpful if the council could provide specifics as to the reasons why a consistent reduction in yearly budget has been viewed as insufficient when contrasted with other city departments. Thank you.
So I'm happy to jump in and then, so I think several of your statements, the assumptions are flawed. The school budget and tuition example is actually, and I'll speak for myself, is the point of concern that I expressed last year, is the fact that the towns that utilize this resource don't pay for it, unlike schools where they do pay tuition. So that's your analogy is actually supporting what my position has been and concern has been. The role of this council is not to, we don't have line item control over the library. We don't have line item control over the school budget. We do have line item control over the rest of the city. So our responsibility by charter is to either approve the budget of the school in total or to say we need to reduce it by X%. Same with the library. So when we make those statements, those are based in terms of our ability, that's our level. And then it goes back, for the school board, it goes back, and once it's approved by this council, it goes out for referendum for the school. And then for the library, if we reduce it, that would be your responsibility to look at the line items to do that. That's how the process works, that's by charter. The discussion that we had in terms of trying to compare one department to another, service by service, they're very different. The city is a very eclectic type of budget with different services, different demands, and each one is individually, we make our decisions on each budget, each department, based on our perspective of what's going on. And I'm not going to rehash everything that we went into last year and things I talked about, but to try to compare one budget to the other is apples and oranges, in my opinion. But I'll open it up to others.
One of the things, just look, I know we're probably past the line items, but I noticed that you budgeted the same amount for heat that you did last year, but you spent more in 2020 for heat when prices were actually lower. So do you think that with the way the heating prices and the fuel prices are going right now, that that's going to be enough?
So, yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me. I will say for fiscal year '20, we actually did crack our windows during COVID because just for increased ventilation. So our heating prices were artificially high. I expect we won't have to do that this coming winter. So I think it's a fair budget amount, but that is a good point. That the
In
prices may go up.
2019, it was over 10,000, so
Let me pull up the. Yeah, I'd have to look. We did get new windows, energy efficient windows. So I believe that was fiscal year 19. So I think we saw increased energy usage then, and we were expecting a decrease. So that's the projection. So, yep. But thanks for the question. Yeah. Other line item questions before I sit down?
Amy, do you have a number on the number of Ellsworth users versus the expected contribution from the city on what that would come out to on a per head basis?
Per user. Again, I'd have to pull the up-to-date number of users to get that data.
If you would, please.
Yeah, I can do that. Yep, I can send that around.
And then also, would you contrast that with what it cost for an out-of-town library card?
For the non-resident fee, you mean,
Yes, please.
the 25? Yep, yep.
Thank you.
And I will clarify too that some of our non-residents reside in towns that we wouldn't request funding from. So a town that already has its own full-service library like Blue Hill, towns in Washington County, we don't request funding from. So the breakdown is a bit diverse in terms of the people who use the library.
I'm sorry, I didn't get a bit of that last one.
Oh, sorry, I'm a little muffled with mask. So the breakdown of non-resident users is not just people, so some of it is towns that we request funding from and they choose not to fund us. Some of it is towns we wouldn't request funding from because they already have a full-service library in their own town, like Blue Hill, Bangor, MDI, and then some are, Washington County users. So I can, we could provide that town breakdown to you if that is helpful. But,
All right, thank you.
thanks.
Hello, Spencer Patterson King. I'm one of the trustees. I'm the secretary on the board there. And I have a question that does get back to schools, but I think also gets to an important point about where we are. Are towns that send students to Ellsworth schools legally obligated to pay for those students?
According to state statute, yes.
Okay. So, as you are aware, because we've gone over this a few times, other towns don't currently have any legal obligation to give the library money. So if I understand right, your plan to get them to contribute more is to cut our funding by approximately 1/6 of our request. And other towns have no legal obligation to us, whereas they do regarding other services we provide. And given that other town meetings, it's been a little here and there because of COVID, but town meetings range from last September up till now. So other towns have already, for the majority of them, set their budget for the next fiscal year, 21-22. How is cutting our budget now for 21-22 going to incentivize other towns who have already set their budgets to increase our funding?
So, and again, I'm going to jump in a little bit. I would just say that I'm kind of surprised with the two questions that you've already asked, given that this isn't a new conversation. And the point you just made about the budgets in these towns is the same point you've made for the last 2 years. At what point are you going out and being proactive with these towns before the budgets close? So that's one point. The other point is that I would have thought that you would be coming here to maybe talk about some of the struggles that COVID presented, how it impacted the library, some of the ideas that you had in place to address the $100,000 that was removed. Haven't heard any of that. This wasn't new. This was part of the discussion, and I can read verbatim from the minutes from the meeting. You had the year for the planning. I would have expected that kind of conversation to get us to understand what you've been doing and maybe some of the challenges that have been experienced.
That is
But let me finish. But you come in here and start saying the same things that you've presented before and start an accusatory tone about what our position is. So if you want to go down that line, just going to let you talk, you go for it, ask all your questions, and then we'll adjourn. Anybody else want to make a comment?
I would like to say that what I'm trying to do with not even rehashing, but trying to reestablish what we can all agree on, which is why I'm asking those questions. If you'd like to talk about what we've been doing the last year, I am more than happy to. Amy's already given a little detail of what we've gone through. I have some more questions about exactly what those struggles have been, though. So last year, when we were having our discussion, we decided to form an ad hoc committee that can meet in private, specifically to discuss ways we can improve as a city council and a board of trustees the library budget to the benefit of everyone, and do it with representatives, so we didn't necessarily need to form a public meeting, so we could meet as needed, so that we could work in earnest, in private, without necessarily receiving public pressure over the discussions we were having. How many times has that committee met?
We had
Once.
We had one phone call.
Once. How many,
And why was that?
that was September.
No, why? Why was that?
That is a good question. How many times since then has the library board invited city council to form another meeting?
Would you like me to go to the emails and read them?
You can if you like.
Would you like me to do that?
There
Because
are-
if you want facts, we can put facts on the table.
Absolutely. There are a
Well, we can-
number of invitations since that time. And I understand, city council has been extremely busy.
So, Council Grindle, I'll turn to you. You were on the committee.
Right.
Do you want to answer that question?
I don't remember. I'm sorry. I remember the one call that we had.
Yep.
And then after that, I don't remember another one, but I don't remember any other emails and
Neither do I.
I
I
apologize.
I find that extremely disappointing, honestly, because I can recall 4 that we've sent off the top of my head, and I'm sure we have more.
Do you have the dates? Because I'll look them up. I mean, if you want, again, based on the comment, and I'm going to ask the other councilors for a second. At this point, we're hearing the budget, and this is kind of going down a different road. Are you interested in going down this road, or do you want to hear more about the budget? Because I'm not sure at this point it's helpful to have this kind of conversation for our purposes.
I think stay on track with the budget.
My question then is, how are we as a board of elected officials supposed to respond and work with city council to improve our standing with other councils in other towns who are currently under no legal obligation to us if council won't meet with the board?
So, I just heard Council Grindle and Council Kaplan, who were part of that committee representing the council, say very clearly that there were no other invitations. So for you to stand there and continue to say that is not fair.
Councilor Hamilton, I know there
All
are
right.
2 emails to you specifically asking for help scheduling those meetings.
And that's when we got the meeting scheduled, and that's why I said I'm happy to read the emails. I'm happy to do that, because I know exactly what emails you're talking about.
Who here was elected to determine the library budget?
What was that question?
Who here was elected to determine the library budget?
Who here was elected to determine the library budget?
All 7 of us.
The library budget?
Yes, sir.
Per the charter, the library board of
You-
trustees.
You come to us with a budget, we say yay or nay on it. So in answer to your question, all 7 of us. And may I add, Mr. Patterson King, your accusatory tone is not helping the library's cause. It's not helping the citizens of Ellsworth. I would suggest, and I would suggest strongly, that you change your tone.
All right, Mr. Blanchett.
I will
Is there
say,
anything,
I will say I agree with him. You stand there and keep going the way you're going, you're marching backwards, not forward. You make that choice.
counselors, is there anything I could have said that might have dissuaded you from cutting our budget?
First of all, you came in here with an assumption about what we were and weren't going to do. We've had some discussions. This was an opportunity to have a dialogue. That's what this meeting was for. We purposely scheduled another meeting so that the trustees, at their request, your request, could be here to have a conversation. We entered this with a starting point. We all entered with a starting point. We entered it last year with a starting point, and we arrived at the same place. Different solution, but the same place. So you come in here tonight with an assumption, and then you want to make these accusations to us, and I absolutely agree with that comment. That has done nothing but a disservice. This isn't a dialogue anymore. This has turned into an absolute defensive, accusatory tone. This isn't producing anything productive. It is not moving the needle on any process, and it's not building any kind of relationship between us. We could have had a conversation, but you've turned that around and made it so that it's not. And I'm not sure at this point you're going to be able to turn that around. I'm not interested in hearing more of what you have to say.
Honestly, I feel like I genuinely can understand your position. I do. However, as someone who is elected specifically by the people of Ellsworth to act in the best interest of them regarding the library, I can honestly say that this is a conservative budget. It's a reduction in our appropriation. It's a full budget. It is something that I think we can all be extremely proud of. And given that other city departments are, as Craig noted, rightly recognized for their efforts with their budgets, I think the library should be applauded for ours too. And I think that what our director has managed to do is extremely impressive. We've expanded our services in the face of COVID, in the face of reduced budget last year. And it's genuinely remarkable, I think, the things that the library staff has been able to accomplish. And I want them to continue to be able to provide those services to the people of Ellsworth. And I have been somewhat accusatory. However, I feel like, in all honesty, I've been given no reason to believe that there is a good faith effort on behalf of City Council to consider the possibility of meeting our budget request that we've put together. Based on previous conversations, based on comments that city councilors have made, in private to board and library staff and other citizens of the town. I apologize to everyone on the council if I became grating in that regard. But I would also ask council to understand my frustration. That we are working our hardest in the earnest and honest best efforts of this city. And to see such magnificent work go not only unappreciated, but underappreciated is extremely frustrating.
Dialogue. A dialogue. A dialogue presupposes that there's a kind of shared perspective on what we're trying to achieve. Councilor Hamilton, what I referenced in terms of the schools was merely to say, in most council situations, in most communities I'm aware of, there would be some acknowledgement of a department being able to consistently, over 5 years, reduce its budget. It's not necessarily that I'm comparing apples and oranges or apples and apples. What I was trying to say is that Amy Weinhardt and our staff, and to an extent the trustees that try to maintain this process, have been faced with a very draconian situation. I can recall clearly, Councilor Hamilton, in December of 2019, Councilor Phillips and yourself joined us for a meeting at the library. At that meeting, the comment was made, and it was made, I think, not adversarially as much as perhaps an alert, but there was a comment made, if you don't deal with your budget, we will. Councilor Blanchette, when you make the comment that you control the budget, it's quite true. The council approves the final authorization. But by definition, the way you frame that, you're almost saying, in a sense, yes, you're the library trustees. You can allocate and deal with the funds we assign as you feel is appropriate, as professionally appropriate, but we may decide to make a significant cut that forces you to do something we feel you should have done before. I don't experience this as adversarial at all. As a relative newcomer to this type of thing, my response is, I have been incredibly impressed with Amy Weinhardt's attempt over the last year plus to deal with her situation. You're quite right, Dale. We should make much more information available, I think, here in terms of the enormous amount of work that Amy Weinhardt and our staff have done to deal with COVID. Ironically, if any of you happen to utilize email, the library puts out on a weekly basis a newsletter. Over the course of the last year, that newsletter has illustrated very clearly what the library has done in terms of addressing COVID. Before City Hall reopened, for safety reasons, we reopened to an extent. We tried as much as possible to service the individuals we serve. I talked to 2 families within the last 2 weeks who said, we can no longer afford broadband. We can no longer afford internet. The library and Wi-Fi is our only way of utilizing that. I did have something I was going to read, but frankly, it's a bit chilling, Councilor Hamilton, to have your response saying, if you continue on a certain path, we'll simply adjourn. I respect the fact that the council has put enormous effort into the budget as a whole. I respect the fact that you've got much on your plate. All we represent is the library. But as we represent the library, I think it's important for us to do the best we can to do that. I'm kind of at a bit of a loss at this point because I'm sensing that, for example, Spencer's questions or my questions will be seen somehow as accusatory instead of explanatory. For me, at least, they're not accusatory at all. But I am puzzled. I am sensing that the library has been a bit of a challenge for some time, but to be honest with you, and not having your background, I don't understand why. The library represents roughly 2.5% of the total city budget for Ellsworth. It is a very small component in terms of cost and structure to the overall program. I understand the comments made in terms of the number of cardholders, the curiosity about how many are Ellsworth residents. the cost to an Ellsworth resident to maintain the library. But I also struggle with the fact that a week ago, walking the trails in the area at the Black House, a young couple I ran into from New Jersey happened to ask me for directions. We got into a conversation. They had 2 young children kind of running all about. We got into a conversation about the 2 things they evaluate when they look to move to this area from New Jersey. The schools were first. They had 2 young children. The second was library. They asked about the library. They asked about our programs. They asked about our services. I have difficulty in trying to clearly, and in a way that's helpful to you, as well as to the community at large, underscore how I see, as I've become a member of the board over time, and now had roughly 1.5 to 2 years tenure with it, incredibly important the library is in a symbolic and complex way, which is not easily broken down into financials. It's disheartening to me, and I'm kind of winging it now because I realize if I read this, I may be accused of being accusatory.
But, let me say this. We just heard nothing that we've said last year, and again, I'll speak for myself, nothing that I said last year, and in fact, I'm very confident that I made this statement, was a reflection on what Amy has done or hasn't done, or what the Board of Trustees has done or hasn't done. We've never had that discussion, and we've never made that accusation. The discussion has been, and you will recall, about the rationale behind the concern about it is the cost per citizen for the library and paying for other non-citizens, non-residents, and that's been the area of concern. And that's been an issue that we've talked about. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a real issue. And it's shared by members of this community, and other members of this community very much strongly say, I don't mind paying for that. I think we should keep the budget. That's been the discussion. So to try to turn this around as though we're insinuating something isn't fair.
No.
And let me finish. And the other thing is, Amy just presented the budget. That's as far as we got. We didn't say one thing. No counselor here we asked a couple of questions. There was nothing else at that point. And then all of a sudden, the statements that were made and the conversations that were levied were not about, where do you stand with the budget, counselors? What are your concerns? Here's what we're dealing with. It wasn't about that. So that's why I said what I said, is if that's going to be the process, this is not productive. If the conversation were something different, then we could have a productive conversation. So you can try to turn this around and make it about us not willing to listen, but you're the 2 individuals, and not all of you, 2 individuals who got up and started accusing us of things before we even made a comment about the budget.
And what you just did, in a sense, Councilor Hamilton, is frame a situation in a certain way.
A very accurate way. Councilor Kaplan.
And that's not how I feel.
Councilor Kaplan.
So let's assume that only Ellsworth residents use the library. How much would this budget change if only Ellsworth residents were actually utilizing the library? Because you're still going to have to heat the place, you're still going to have data processing, you're still going to have the safety equipment. So how much of this budget would actually change if it was only Ellsworth residents?
I'm going to defer to Amy because that's her area of expertise. I would gently suggest to you that, I think in a sense I agree with Dale, but from completely different perspective. Yes, I have a disagreement with the perspective of looking at the library from a card holder versus out-of-resident perspective. I think it's more than that. It's a complex thing to explain. And I'm not challenging what the council is saying. I'm simply saying that I look at it differently. So, Councilor Hamilton, when you say, yes, there are differences of opinion, but this is the way we see it, I think what Spencer was attempting to do, and what I was attempting to do, is simply say, the library is incredibly important in ways that make it difficult to simply address it in terms of, if the library had simply Ellsworth card holders, the 2 libraries in our area, Jessup and Blue Hill, have no card fees. They have an advantage, and I'll acknowledge that. The advantage is they have a much more complex bequest system with a much deeper pocket to utilize for some of their funding. But despite that, Bangor has no card fees. So I'm thinking to myself, can we somehow work between what you're talking regarding your question and those people in Trenton or Hancock or Aurora or some of the small towns that have almost no physical base at all that use the library? I'm not overly concerned that others use the library. I would like them to do as much as they can, and if you had seen over the last year, and I think in a sense, Councilor Hamilton, you may be correct in terms of our presentation, in the sense, we should do much more. Our director spent weeks and weeks and weeks attempting to work with, during the COVID situation, when most town meetings, as you know, did not meet. Last spring, there were no town meetings, so it was a huge block of that. Despite that, through letters in part that were signed by the council, which was helpful, we attempted to suggest to the towns they needed to look seriously at providing a bit more support for the library as a community resource. My frustration or my disappointment is that despite what we seem to do, and despite the volumes of information already provided over the last 2 years, there seems to be a suggestion, and no, it's never been said, Councilor Hamilton, you're quite right, but by tithing $100,000 off our budget, it seems to be there's a suggestion, and I could be completely wrong, that somehow the trustees have not been as physically responsible, perhaps, as they could be, or somehow we have missed something that we should have done. And I think to myself, the range of professionals that we have contacted over the last 2 years, library science professionals, people who work in the field, and said to them, can we do something else? What have we missed? It's not that we've been profligate and irregarding of finances. It's that we can't quite figure out, in terms of maintaining a creditable level of service and support, how to do that without major changes to our situation if we have to deal with this much of a cut. Now, on that note, I didn't mean to dismiss your question. My apologies. So, Amy, could you? Because I really don't feel I should address that. I think that's something that Amy would be more skilled with.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I certainly agree that a lot of the fixed costs would remain, so all the, the building costs, heating costs. It's hard to project because there are a lot of services we don't, that we don't require a library card for, so we would always be getting people from out of town who come to a library program, who use our Wi-Fi, use our computers. I think our staffing would probably, if we maintain the hours, we probably couldn't reduce our staff by very much. We do maintain mostly 2 staff at the desk at all times. So I suspect Ellsworth only, we wouldn't reduce our budget a huge amount, but it's hard to extrapolate, of course. I do think we provide a benefit to the city by pulling those people from other towns who can,
Yes, so
do business downtown.
basically, if this was just an Ellsworth library, the cost wouldn't go down all that much. So the fact that we're still servicing other towns isn't really changing our cost if it was only Ellsworth residents.
And might I
That's a good
add
point.
that with our annual appeal fund and so forth, the out-of-town patrons are some of our major supporters. So they give and they volunteer and so forth. So we do benefit in other ways from the out-of-town patrons.
Would there be any benefit to investing in self-serve technology? I mean, I go to Walmart now and I have to check out my own groceries, right? So is there any benefit to self-serve technology that might reduce your labor cost?
Oh, excuse me, could you have her come to the mic? We are having tough time hearing her. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you want to repeat that?
I
So I'll just repeat it for the public. The comment that Ann Lusby made was about our out-of-town residents often are our biggest support, some of our biggest supporters in our fundraising appeals happen to be people who live out of town. So we value that support too, to supplement our operating budget. And I think certainly, there are a lot of fixed costs that are involved in, library use. So I appreciate the question. Thank you.
I think I'm missing something, because everybody keeps saying $100,000 is getting cut. I guess it must've been something that before I got here. Okay, so anyways, I would like to recognize her for cutting down as much as she could, and it seems like she's done a good job presenting herself tonight. And I'm with you on, it went downhill from there. I've been trying to figure out why. I'm sitting here and somebody's telling me that I'm basically chopping them, and I haven't done anything. I haven't had a chance to even think about this budget. I mean, it started out on the wrong foot, so let's get back on foot with Ron, and let's see what we can figure out here.
Okay, thank you. Most of you know me, my name's Ron Fortier. I'm presently the board chair. A few of the questions that have come up tonight, I'd like to kind of directly, quickly answer. I hadn't planned on speaking, so I have no notes. I'm going to have to do this off the cuff. We did a study, 2 studies, over the last 20 years I've been here, that took out of the formula the out-of-town visitors. We just said, okay, what would it cost us to run the library, period, no matter who comes in through the door? Keep the heat on, keep the lights on, keep everybody employed and busy. And it was very, very small percentage of money that the out-of-towners were responsible for, so to speak, in the business. We're charged, as you are, with serving the taxpayers. We've tried over the years to look at different programs, look at different methods of calculating. The latest one is the per capita charge rather than the per cardholder charge that we were doing. We really haven't had a lot of time for feedback, excuse me, from that change, because in the last 2 years, there have been very, very few town meetings. I used to go to them, a good portion of them, as did everybody, and we were always able to sit down with the select boards or the budget committees and say, okay, this is why we're doing this. This is, the other point. We could have 300 people, and we have, come through the doors of the library in a given day. Until they want to remove something from our collection, they don't need cards. We're open to the public. So, saying that 30% of our business is out-of-towners, a lot of it's going to be a guess. In the summertime, on a rainy day, and I think Amy will back me up on this, get a rainy day in July when everybody's here from New Jersey and Massachusetts or wherever, they're at camp, it's raining, they need books. They come down, sit in the library and read books, or arrange for a library card so they can take them back to camp. So throwing that into the formula, excuse me, what we've tried to do in the last 10 years, and more importantly in the last 5 years, is try to find savings in the programs. Try to find savings in when we purchase our materials, savings in the running of the physical plant, the heat and the lights and water and everything. A lot of the expenses are not in our control. As Manager Mojo would say, the insurance expenses, we don't have any control. City manager doesn't have any control. They are what they are. That being said, we have been trying, we've made a real concerted effort in the last 5 years to keep that curve going in the right position, in the right direction. So we're still going to hopefully find more savings this year, find more savings the year after that, and do the best we can do. And any other questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
No, what I've said from my involvement with this has been the question and the concern, that it's not just mine, this is a shared concern from others, is the rate in terms of when you look at what a Ellsworth resident pays for the library relative to non-residents and the overall cost, that's the issue, and that's the question. And ultimately, there's a point at which this agreement in terms of what should the budget be? What does it look like? What does this community want for a library? The seven of us, and this composition changes, every has an opportunity every November to change. The seven people sitting around the table weigh in on that, but they represent the voice of the community. And as you know, there are differences of opinion. That's been the discussion. And that's what I think we're trying to wrestle with. And it's no different than when we talk about Monday, when we get to the roads. That's as highly contentious as this discussion in terms of why aren't we budgeting more? Why aren't we fixing this road and that road? It's a process, and it's about discussion, and we're not going to always agree. But we should be able to have a conversation without it becoming this issue that is personal, and somehow that we're not, that we're saying, well, boy, you're just not doing a good job, and we're going to tell you what to do. That has not been the discussion. So we have to go back last year to understand why we're here today and what the discussion, where we started from. Because last year set the table for today. And we didn't really get to that place. We jumped to that. So I appreciate you coming up and giving that historical perspective.
The only other comment I wanted to make, sir, Dale, is, Mr. Chairman, is that, you know, we talk about out-of-towners or non-Ellsworth taxpayers. And that's been kind of in the mix for 2 years now. And I am not doing the comparison thing, but that would be like the police chief saying we need toll booths at the city lines for non-residents to use our roads. We have to walk the line, not only being fiscally responsible for the library, but the library is also a big draw for the city. We've been told this many, many, many times. And as Craig mentioned, people moving in, they want to know the quality of the police department, quality of the fire department, but most of all, they want to know the quality of the schools and the quality of the library.
And I think you're right. And I think that's the ultimate, unfortunately, it comes down to you have to put a dollar amount on that.
Right.
What is the community willing to pay, recognizing all the things you said about tourists and surrounding communities? At the end of the day, what does this community want to put? Because we could put a lot, we could double the budget. You know, if the community wanted that, then so that's part of this process, is to try to figure out
Yeah.
what that amount of taxpayer funds to support the library that this community wants to support. And that's what we're representing. Some of us have a difference of opinion from you. That's what we've been talking about. And there is disagreement around that.
So what are you trying to do, like break it down as to how many people pay taxes in Ellsworth, as to how much per person would have to pay to cover the library budget?
I mean, these are suggestions, and the bottom line, as Dale said, our only control or statement is to set the amount of money we're willing to give them during the appropriation process. How they spend it and what they do to change their ways is that trustee's choice and the library's choice, not ours. It's just the same as the school, Gene. You give them the bottom line, they do what they want with it.
I just, before I go sit back down again, the only other point, and this is in no way, please don't take this as any kind of a threat or anything else, is the bottom line of our budget right now is at a point where if we are given substantially less than that, there will be layoffs, there will be hours cut, there will be unemployment more than likely. People want full-time work. If we can't give them full-time work, then they'll probably go somewhere else. There's always that chance. And you know, we really wouldn't like to see that. We've tried to cut everything that we could cut without going to that point. Thank you.
And
Yeah.
before you start, I just want to clear something up, because you and I were having the exchanges early on when we said we wanted to form this committee. Is it also your recollection that you and I did have a series of email exchange to find a date?
Yep.
We found a date, and we formed the committee, we assigned the counselors, and you had that first meeting, and from that, you had the committee. And after that, that was left to the committee to decide when they were going to meet. So the idea that
That
there
is
was.
also my recollection, Dave.
Okay, thank you.
You know, there's a lot of things in the last year and a half that have affected your business, my business, and the library's business. And taking those in consideration, I think we're all damn lucky. We're still collecting money and still moving on, so. Hopefully we can, as I say, hopefully we can continue the curve slowly. And I may not be involved in it, but I'm sure that the board will carry on. Unless there's any other questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Dale, I think, obviously, we have to find a way to be more clarity in terms of how we see the people we work with on a daily basis. Dale mentioned that the core issue, in a way, is the cost to residents of Ellsworth, the library, and how to proportionalize and deal with that. But Councillor Kaplan made an interesting point when she said, in all reality, if no one but Ellsworth residents use the library, there would not really be, and it came to the point that there would not really be a significant cost reduction. So in a way, I'm kind of stuck, because I'm thinking, I can see Dale's point, it's a valid one. I can see your point, it's a valid one. If indeed it's not who is using the library, but what do we want for a library, what can we afford with other expenses, as with roads, which I'm sure is very challenging, how can we as trustees present to you with enough clarity, not only the work that Amy and the staff have done with what they have, but that people we've consulted, and we've said, for example, those of you that are familiar with schools know that if you have a teacher with a classroom of 20, and you say to the teacher, we have some real tax issues and some funding issues, you'll have to take 30 kids. Can a teacher work with 30 kids? Theoretically, yes. Is it going to be ideal? No. We've talked to various professionals and said, what's the minimum number of staff we can function with? And I guess we haven't done a very good job in explaining that at our current budget structure, with what we have, we can work with less. We may need to work with less, but it will mean a change in service structure. And we've been trying to think of ways to square the needle, to square the circle in terms of trying to thread the needle, in terms of if we have to face a significant reduction in budget, can we do that? I mean, you're quite right, Councillor Phillips, when you say we will have to learn to work with less. But for a program such as the library, which has a diverse range of interactions with community and people in the communities in the area, that's going to be a challenge. So if we gave the impression that we assume something, that's not what we intended to do. We have a concern, our staff, I've been disheartened and demoralized over the last year to see the impact of our staff, who are very, very dedicated and very invested, in wondering what the commitment of the council will be over time. Not that there won't be a commitment, of course there will. But will that commitment reduce to the extent that there'll be major changes in staffing structure? It's very demoralizing to be a young staff person investing and working in the library, thinking in X number of months, they won't have a position. And it was very appreciative that the council was willing and did give us a year, give us a delay in that process. But what that did in a way is simply postpone the reality that right now, for many of our staff, I think it's a question as to what comes next. So do we have some foreboding about what we may have to deal with? Yes. Are we hoping that there'll be some modification or some change in the final decision? Of course. But And standing here, I'm thinking, we have done our best, I think, to try and present to the council the realities as we see them, living with them on a kind of day-to-day basis, acknowledging that you have many more realities to deal with than ours. But I would gently and respectfully say to you that I think Councillor Kaplan is not incorrect when she says it really isn't who's using the library. Because people from away that use the library shop, go to restaurants, spend a day of it, and I think for many of them, especially during the summer season, and the tourists that come up and use the library, there's probably a bit of a balance between what Ellsworth residents pay currently, tithes for the library's part of the budget,
So-
and income they receive.
Would, at this point, just repeating what's been said. So,
I'm sorry, Dale, I think I'm very invested in this. at
Well,
this
and
point,
I
if
appreciate that. I'm just-
repeating it,
I'm just-
and if and you keep qualifying everything we
Please.
say as not quite what we
Okay.
should be doing, so
Mr. McDonald, please.
I'll close.
Thank you.
Mr.
Councilor
Hamilton,
Phillips.
I have no doubt in Amy's abilities or sincerity. I think she's done a terrific job over there. But in reality, we're all sitting here and we're discussing this back and forth. And on July 2nd, 2020, we acted and gave you the money we gave you. And in that discussion was the fact that this year you're going to get less money. So you come in and you sit here before us and you present us status quo. And you are, and it's politics whether you like it or not. This group of 7 a year ago decided this is what we're comfortable with. We told you what we were comfortable with. And the makeup of the board didn't change. So you come in 1 year later, show us the same exact thing you showed us a year ago, all knowing that the target was less. And I understand that if you want to stay the same, this is what it's going to cost you. But that gave you a year to realize that without the makeup of the council changing and the thought process changing, that you should be looking at the different ways to do it. And it may be staffing cuts, it's going to be cut back on hours or whatever you need to do. But it's not a surprise. This is a year later and it's the same thing. This is not new information.
I agree, and with due respect, we have reduced our budget. And I think what we're asking for is, this last year was the first year of implementing a new system, moving to request on a per capita basis with the outside Ellsworth service towns that we work with. And you got a hell of a wrench thrown into the gears with COVID. That made it much more difficult. But we've still managed to budget for more funding from outside towns. And it's the first year that residents from other towns are experiencing whether or not they have to pay for a card. It's the first year where those residents have a chance to go to their select boards, their city councils, and discuss that matter with them. And I feel like all we're asking is that you grant us the same grace that you've necessarily had to grant yourselves regarding something like the emergency medical services situation. It's a thorny issue, and you're working through it. And it's been 3 years since county ambulance shuttered, I think. And you know, you're trying contracts, you're looking at city-owned services, you're exploring the options. We are too, and we're trying to get the process further and further so we can improve and meet the standards that we all established, the city council and the library board, during our strategic plan that we set. And like Amy pointed out, we've met a great many of those goals, and we did it in partnership with the council. What we're asking is that you allow us to continue working to the best of our ability, to keep improving that, to let the citizens of our other service area towns work with their select boards. Because, as I'm sure you know, it's not a quick process with issues like this. And again, I mentioned the emergency medical services because it's been 3 years and it's still a hard problem, right? This is a hard problem too, and we are working as hard as we can on it. And we will continue to work hard, and I can promise you that. It's going to be tougher to be successful with that if we have to remove programs, services, hours, or personnel. It's just going to be harder to improve funding from outside sources. So please consider that too when you make your decision.
Mr. Patterson King,
Yes.
you used the phrase to keep improving that when it comes to the budget.
Mhm.
This year, next year, and ensuing years. Despite what it says on this slide, the city appropriation last year was $461,872. This year, the library is asking for just a hair under $545,000. It's an increase of $83,035, an 18% increase. Where the 3% less than last year on this slide came from is beyond me. An 18% increase is not an improvement.
So
In 1 year, 18% rate of inflation, I don't know, what, 3 or 4%, give or take? I don't believe there's another department in the city that is looking at an 18% increase.
as I'm sure you recall, last year, part of the arrangement that we all agreed to was that remaining funds outside of appropriation, stuff that had already been appropriated, would be used in conjunction with the appropriation to essentially lower that. So
The
18%
assigned fund balance
is.
did not come out of the pockets of the taxpayers last year. That was a fund balance that the library had. No matter how you slice it, what came out of the pockets last year of the taxpayer was $461,872.
I
have it right here in front of me.
No. I absolutely believe you, and I totally understand where you're coming from. I think I agree with a slightly different perspective on it, in that that money did come from the taxpayers to a total budget then that was 3% over what this budget is. The timing of the appropriation is different. It did not come out of last year's appropriation. You're absolutely correct. It still came from the taxpayers to support the library.
That's correct. That's why I said last year's appropriation. This year's
So-
appropriation, you're asking for $545K, an increase of $83,000. Like I stated, that's not an improvement. This has nothing new. This has been ongoing for just about 3 years. And the library board seems to want to frame this as something new that's come up in the last year, and to, oh, please, give us a chance. It's been 3 years.
Did you have something specific you wanted to address?
Just because I put that slide together, so I wanted to clarify the number so that, I definitely get your point, Councilor Blanchett. So library trustees did request a city appropriation of $561,000 last year. City council made a $100,000 cut. They pulled it from the library assigned fund balance. That $100,000 had been slated for capital projects for the library. So essentially, it was kicking the can down the road. So that $100,000 that it does need to come to address some of our capital improvement needs, and that will be additional tax funds we'll have to be spending in the future. So the reduction that I was just trying to point out was the library trustees had created that budget. That $100,000 was still city funding. I get your point that it wasn't direct tax appropriation, but it is a reduction of our budget. We reduced expenditures and we increased outside revenue to make up a $17,000 increase in our outside sources of funding. So just to clarify, does that, any clarifying questions about that number?
No, I've said my piece.
Okay.
Thank you.
So one request that I would have, and I step back, you mentioned the emergency services, so I'm going to use that as an example. You state, well, we had to come in and we had to make these accusations and we had to make this approach because we hear that you've made up your mind and that individually you're at this point. This is a process. And the EMS, I have been very clear in terms of I'm not a big fan of entering into a contract with the provider based on a number of factors, based on the cost to the city and what I think is appropriate. But through a series of discussions, I'm probably most likely going to vote in favor of it. Just because I have one perspective going into a topic doesn't mean that I'm not open to hearing other perspectives and changing that. And I'm assuming that everyone here is the same. That's part of any process. So the opportunity to present why a budget is going to not go down as here's what has happened, here's what we've done, here is why we can't get to the number that you had put on us last year, this is why we're requesting more than what we are allocated from last year, and these are all the reasons. And prior to that, we've met with this group, it only happened once. Why weren't there more meetings? All of those things are factors in terms of having the discussion. That didn't happen. That wasn't the presentation. That wasn't the discussion that took place this evening. And that's unfortunate. So my request is I would love to have information, if you can email it to me, that would inform me in terms of what have been some of the barriers. What have you run into? Why are you requesting the number? What prevents you from achieving those goals? Rather than just accusing individuals on this council of this, that, or the other thing. Because that would help me to make an informed decision when we ultimately vote on the budget. So if you have that kind of information, I welcome it and would appreciate that email to me. And I'm assuming
I
others
would
would
like
want
to
that.
see that too.
Any other questions or comments from the council?
Yeah,
Is it something different, new?
it is very much different, in a sense. I'm going to say this a little differently.
You have 2 minutes.
We did not arrive here to be challenging. We arrived here to try to make a sense of where we are. You just framed us, in a sense, as coming in ill-prepared, not clearly defined, and providing very little actual information that was helpful. I disagree with that, in a sense, but I think the major issue for me is that we are still in a situation where someone might say, I see no improvement at all. I'm discounting the fact that your department has come in under budget for 5 years in a row, reduced its budget 5 years in a row each year.
So it's,
I
you're
understand,
rehashing.
with respect.
We're done with the comments. And what I would say to you, go back, watch the Facebook, and then objectively look at how this was presented from the beginning.
Fine.
And maybe you'll get a different
I will
impression. Maybe you might even talk with the other members of the Board of Trustees. With no more comments, any other comments from the council? We're adjourned.